Las Vegas, November 21st, 1976. Frank Sinatra challenged Elvis to a singing contest. Who's the real king? What happened next became legendary. 2,000 people at Caesar's Palace held their breath because music history's greatest duel was about to begin. This story reveals how two legends turned rivalry into respect and the surprising way they discovered what real artistry means. Subscribe to Elvis Presley Legacy Stories, because these hidden chapters show us that even kings can learn from each other. And if this story resonates with you, share it, because we've all experienced moments when competition could either destroy or build bridges. Frank Sinatra was performing a special gala at Caesar's Palace that night. The 61-year-old chairman of the board was still the undisputed king of Vegas, commanding the room with that unmistakable voice and magnetic presence that had defined American entertainment for 3 decades. His tuxedo was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his blue eyes held that familiar mixture of confidence and danger that had made him both beloved and feared throughout Hollywood. But what shocked everyone was Elvis Presley sitting in the audience. The king of rock and roll was practically lounging in his front row table, wearing a black silk shirt unbuttoned, just enough to show the gold chains around his neck. At 41, Elvis was still devastatingly handsome, his dark hair slicked back in that iconic style, his presence so magnetic that even in a room full of celebrities, all eyes kept drifting to him. He seemed relaxed, sipping his usual Pepsi Cola and occasionally nodding along to Sinatra's performance. But those who knew him could see the slight tension in his shoulders. The tension between these two legends had been brewing for years like a storm, gathering strength. Sinatra had publicly called Elvis's music anti-art and a rancid-smelling aphrodisiac back in the 1950s when rock and roll first threatened the established order of American popular music. Elvis, for his part, had never directly responded to these criticisms, but those close to him knew the comments had stung deeply. But what Elvis didn't know yet was Sinatra had planned this night as a special reckoning. The atmosphere in the Copa Room was electric with possibility and tension. Old Hollywood royalty filled the front tables. Dean Martin was there with his characteristic martini and cigarette. Sammy Davis Jr. sat nearby with his wife Altavise, and various other Rat Pack members occupied the prime real estate near the stage. Casino executives watched nervously from the wings, knowing both men's personalities and their capacity for unpredictability. Having them both in the same room was either going to be a public relations goldmine or a complete disaster. And right now, it was impossible to tell which way the evening would swing. Wait until you see what happened next. Halfway through his set, Sinatra stopped mid-song during Fly Me to the Moon and looked directly at Elvis with those piercing blue eyes that had intimidated presidents and mob bosses alike. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying that familiar authority that could silence any room in America. "We have a very special guest tonight, the so-called king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley." The word so-called hung in the air like a challenge. The emphasis on those two words was unmistakable, delivered with just enough bite to make it clear this wasn't simple name-calling, but a deliberate provocation. The audience turned to look at Elvis in stunned silence. Champagne glasses frozen halfway to lips. Conversations dying mid-sentence as everyone realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Elvis slowly stood up, that famous smile spreading across his face. But there was something different about it tonight. This wasn't the boyish grin that had charmed millions of fans, or the humble expression he wore when meeting dignitaries. This was the smile of a man who had been waiting for this moment, who was ready for whatever Frank Sinatra thought he could dish out. "Frank," Elvis called out, his voice carrying easily across the room with that distinctive Memphis drawl. "That's mighty kind of you to acknowledge me, but I'm curious what you mean by so-called." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sinatra's band stopped playing entirely. Waiters froze in place with trays balanced on their hands. Even the background noise from the casino floor seemed to quiet down, as if the entire building was holding its breath. That's when everything changed. Sinatra walked to the edge of the stage with the confidence of a man who owned not just the room but the entire city. His movements were deliberate, calculated, like a boxer sizing up his opponent before the first punch. "Elvis," he said, his voice now carrying a slight edge that anyone who'd seen him angry would recognize as dangerous territory. You're young, you've got energy, I'll give you that. But real music, real artistry, that takes experience, son. That takes understanding of the craft that goes beyond shaking your hips and making teenage girls scream. The insult was delivered with surgical precision, designed to hit Elvis where it would hurt most: his legitimacy as an artist, his right to be mentioned in the same breath as the giants of American popular music. Murmurs rippled through the audience like wildfire. Some people were filming with their small cameras, sensing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for decades. "What do you say, Elvis?" Sinatra continued, spreading his arms wide in a gesture that seemed welcoming but carried an undercurrent of mockery. "Why don't you come up here and show us what real music looks like? Show all these fine people what makes you think you deserve to be called the king of anything." The challenge was unmistakable now. This wasn't friendly banter between entertainers. This was a public calling out, a demand that Elvis prove himself worthy of the respect he'd commanded for 2 decades. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet. Elvis made a move that shocked everyone in the room, including Sinatra himself. Without hesitation, he stood up and started walking toward the stage with the fluid grace of a big cat, every movement conveying confidence and barely contained power. "Frank," Elvis said as he climbed the steps to the stage, his voice now carrying its own edge of steel beneath the southern charm, "are you really giving me a music lesson? In front of all these nice people?" The audience was on the edge of their seats now, sensing they were about to witness either a spectacular confrontation or something even more unexpected. Security guards positioned themselves strategically around the room, unsure whether they were about to deal with a fight or something unprecedented in Vegas. "Entertainment history. That's exactly what I'm doing," Sinatra replied with that trademark grin that could be either charming or menacing, depending on the circumstances. "What do you say? A little competition? Let's see if you can handle yourself in front of a real Vegas audience." Elvis now stood center stage with Sinatra, 2 titans of American entertainment facing off under the bright lights. The contrast was striking. Sinatra in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, representing the old guard of sophisticated entertainment. Elvis in his silk shirt and gold chains, embodying the newer, raw energy that had transformed popular culture. Don't miss this crucial detail. Sinatra laid out the terms with the precision of a man accustomed to making deals that meant millions of dollars. "Here's how this works. Each of us sings one song. The audience decides the winner. But here's the catch. You sing one of my style songs, and I'll sing one of yours." Elvis's eyes lit up with interest and amusement. This wasn't what he'd expected. "Interesting proposition, Frank. I accept." The atmosphere at Caesar's Palace was now charged with electricity that you could almost touch. 2 music legends were squaring off in an unprecedented musical duel that nobody in the room would ever forget. "But you go first," Elvis said with that characteristic politeness that never quite masked his competitive edge. "Age before beauty." Sinatra laughed, a sound that carried both genuine amusement and a hint of respect for Elvis's boldness. "Careful, kid. You might not like what you hear. What you're about to witness will blow your mind." The band quickly huddled, trying to figure out arrangements on the fly. Orchestra members whispered urgently to each other about keys and tempo changes. The audience was buzzing with excitement and disbelief. Some were already calling their friends, whispering urgently into phones, "You need to get down here. Something incredible is happening." But the real shock was still coming. Frank Sinatra took the microphone and signaled to his orchestra, leader with the confidence of a man who had never met a challenge he couldn't handle. What happened next was something nobody in that room expected. Sinatra began singing "Can't Help Falling in Love," Elvis's signature song, the one that had defined romantic ballads for an entire generation. But he performed it in his own style, transforming it into a smooth jazz number with sophisticated phrasing and that unmistakable Sinatra swing. His voice carried that familiar Sinatra magic, turning Elvis's rock ballad into something completely different, sophisticated, mature, devastating in its emotional precision. Every note was perfectly controlled, every phrase delivered with the kind of technical mastery that came from decades of performing at the highest level. The audience was mesmerized. Even Elvis's most devoted fans had to admit this was extraordinary. Sinatra was proving that great music transcended genre, that artistry could transform any song into something special. But the most shocking thing was Elvis's expression. There was no anger, no offense taken at hearing his signature song transformed. Instead, there was respect, even admiration lighting up his features. When Sinatra finished, the crowd erupted in applause that seemed to shake the building itself. Frank took a small bow and handed the microphone to Elvis with a knowing smile that suggested he knew exactly how good that performance had been. "Your turn, King," he said. And for the first time that night, the word king carried no sarcasm. "Now it's about to get really interesting." Elvis took the microphone and walked to the piano with the measured steps of a man who had just been challenged in the language he spoke best. "Frank," he said, settling onto the piano bench, "that was genuinely impressive. You just taught me something about my own song. You won't believe what happened next." Elvis chose to sing My Way, one of Sinatra's most iconic songs, the anthem that had defined Sinatra's entire philosophy and career. But Elvis didn't perform it rock style as everyone expected. Instead, he sang it even more emotionally than Sinatra usually did, with a vulnerability and rawness that caught everyone off guard. His voice that night was different from anything anyone had heard before. It was as if he was paying musical homage to Sinatra while showing his own artistic depth. Elvis's interpretation wasn't trying to compete with Sinatra's version. It was trying to honor it while bringing something entirely new to the table. He sang with the weight of his own experiences, his own struggles with fame and isolation, his own understanding of what it meant to do things my way. The crowd was absolutely silent, hanging on every word. Even the waiters had stopped serving drinks, caught up in this unprecedented moment of musical conversation between two masters. That's when the real magic began. As Elvis sang I Did It My Way, he looked directly at Sinatra, as if acknowledging the older performer's artistic journey and influence while asserting his own right to that same artistic territory. Sinatra stood mesmerized, watching this young performer transform his signature song into something entirely new yet respectful. This wasn't theft or imitation. This was translation, one artist speaking to another in the universal language of music. What came next changed everything. When both songs were finished, the room fell completely silent. The audience didn't know how to react. They had expected competition, maybe even conflict, but what they had witnessed felt more like a masterclass in mutual respect. Then Sinatra approached Elvis, and everyone expected tension. Here's where the miracle happened. "Elvis," Sinatra extended his hand, his blue eyes bright with something that looked suspiciously like tears. "You taught me something tonight. Real artistry. It's not about style or generation or any of that nonsense. It's about soul." Elvis shook Sinatra's hand firmly, his own voice thick with emotion. "Frank, I learned more about performing in the last 10 minutes than I have in years. You showed me what class really means." The handshake lasted longer than expected, and everyone in the room could see that something profound had just happened. 2 generations of American music had just bridged a gap that had seemed impossible to cross. "You know what, Elvis?" Sinatra grinned, and this time it was purely genuine. "How about we do one together? Show these people what happens when experience meets energy." Everyone learned the truth, but the real shock was still coming. What happened at Caesar's Palace that night became one of Vegas's most unforgettable moments. Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley performed That's Life together. 2 different generations, 2 different styles, but the same musical spirit flowing between them like electricity. Sinatra handled the verses with his sophisticated phrasing and impeccable timing, while Elvis added emotional depth and power to the choruses. The song became a conversation between 2 masters of their craft, each bringing their strengths to create something neither could have achieved alone. But it wasn't just the music that moved the audience to tears. It was watching these 2 titans of entertainment discover that they had more in common than they had differences. The mutual respect was palpable, transforming what had started as a confrontation into a celebration. The audience gave them a standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes, many people openly weeping at having witnessed this unprecedented moment of artistic unity. But wait, there's more to this story. After the song, both men stood at the microphone together, and the image became iconic. 2 kings of American music, arms around each other's shoulders, sharing a moment that would be remembered for decades. Sinatra spoke first. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight proved that great music has no boundaries, no generations, no limits. It just requires honesty and respect." Elvis nodded. "Frank showed me that real artistry isn't about competing with each other. It's about elevating each other. What would you have done?" When faced with a challenge that could have destroyed a relationship, both men chose understanding over ego. After that legendary night, Sinatra and Elvis developed a deep friendship that surprised everyone in the entertainment industry. Frank later said in interviews, "Elvis reminded me that night that talent doesn't age, only bodies do. He's not just the king of rock and roll, he's a king of music, period." Elvis responded in kind. "Frank taught me what real professionalism looks like. It doesn't matter how successful you are. There's always something to learn from someone who's mastered their craft." The mutual respect was genuine and transformative for both men. They began attending each other's shows regularly, sometimes surprising audiences by joining each other on stage for impromptu duets. Hold on, this story has an incredible continuation. After that November night, Caesar's Palace management began hoping for more. Sinatra-Elvis nights. The two performers developed a ritual of acknowledging each other whenever they were both performing in Vegas, creating moments that became legendary among entertainment insiders. Other performers took notice of how the evening had unfolded. The event proved that different musical generations could learn from each other rather than compete, setting a template for collaboration that influenced countless other artists. Dean Martin was heard saying afterward, "Those two knuckleheads just showed us all how to handle our egos. Maybe the rest of us should take notes." What happened next changed entertainment history. The Sinatra-Elvis encounter became a template for cross-generational musical collaboration throughout the industry. It showed that artistic respect could bridge any gap, that competition could transform into cooperation when ego gave way to artistry. Music critics called it the night Las Vegas grew up, when the entertainment capital proved it could host genuine artistic moments, not just spectacle and showmanship. Elvis's words from that night are still remembered. "Music speaks a language that has no age barriers, only heart barriers." The bootleg recordings of that night became some of the most sought-after audio in music history, not for technical perfection, but for the raw emotion and mutual respect captured between two masters, acknowledging each other's greatness. You need to know this incredible detail. Years later, Sammy Davis Jr. revealed what had happened backstage before the challenge. Sinatra had actually planned the whole thing as a test, not to embarrass Elvis, but to see if the younger performer had the artistic maturity to handle himself with grace under pressure. "Frank told me beforehand," Sammy revealed, "if that kid can hang with me musically and personally, he deserves every bit of respect he gets. If he can't, then maybe all those critics were right about rock and roll being a fad." Elvis passed the test with flying colors, earning not just Sinatra's respect but his genuine friendship. But the most touching moment was still to come. After the show in Sinatra's dressing room, the two men had a private conversation that Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager, later described as two artists recognizing each other's greatness without any of the usual show business BS. Sinatra gave Elvis a personal gift that night, a custom-made microphone with both their names engraved on it. "For the other king," the inscription read. Elvis was visibly moved. He gave Frank one of his famous scarves, saying, "Class recognizes class, Frank." Wait until you hear what Frank whispered to Elvis. As Elvis was leaving that night, Sinatra pulled him aside privately. Security and staff heard Frank say, "Kid, you've got more than talent. You've got heart and soul. Don't let anybody in this business tell you different." Elvis responded, "Coming from you, Frank, that means everything. You showed me tonight that respect is earned, not demanded." They shook hands one more time, and both men knew they had participated in something that transcended entertainment and entered the realm of genuine human connection. Incredible revelation coming up. That night profoundly affected Elvis's approach to his craft and his relationships with other performers. According to those close to him, the respect shown by Sinatra, a performer he had long admired, gave him new confidence in his artistry and his place in American music history. Priscilla Presley later said, "After that night with Frank, Elvis carried himself differently. He knew he belonged among the great entertainers, not just the rock performers. It changed how he thought about his legacy. The experience reinforced Elvis's belief that music was about connection and respect, not competition and conflict." The Sinatra-Elvis encounter is now taught in music schools as an example of how artists can challenge each other while maintaining mutual respect and dignity. It proved that different musical styles could coexist and even enhance each other rather than compete for dominance. Here's something most people don't know. The night was filmed by Caesar's Palace's internal cameras, but the footage was considered too precious and personal to release commercially. It remains in the venue's private archives, shown only to VIP guests on very special occasions as a reminder of what genuine artistry looks like. Everything seemed finished, but then the story of that November night became a parable about artistic maturity and mutual respect throughout the entertainment industry. It showed that true greatness comes not from tearing others down, but from lifting them up while elevating yourself. Music historians cite it as the moment when rock and roll gained legitimacy with the old guard of American entertainment, not through force or youth, but through mutual respect and artistic excellence. The handshake between Sinatra and Elvis became symbolic of bridging generational gaps in music and culture, proving that respect transcends age, style, and era. Today, the story is referenced whenever artists from different generations collaborate successfully. From Tony Bennett and Lady Gaga to Willie Nelson and younger country stars, the template set by Sinatra and Elvis continues to inspire cross-generational artistic partnerships. The Copa Room at Caesar's Palace, though renovated many times since, still displays photos from that legendary night, and the story is part of every VIP tour of the property. The phone rang and everything changed. No, that's metaphorical, but the impact of that night changed everything, for both artists and for how the entertainment industry viewed collaboration versus competition. The confrontation between Sinatra and Elvis teaches us that behind every act of challenge can be an opportunity for growth, connection, and mutual respect. It shows that the strongest response to perceived rivalry isn't more rivalry, it's understanding, respect, and the willingness to see the artistry in everyone. Frank could have humiliated Elvis that night. He could have used his Vegas connections and establishment credibility to diminish the younger performer in front of industry peers and media. Instead, he chose to test him, respect him, and ultimately celebrate him. Elvis could have refused the challenge. He could have seen it as a setup or an insult and walked away, preserving his ego but missing an opportunity for growth. Instead, he rose to the occasion and showed that rock and roll could hold its own in any musical arena. Almost 50 years later, people still talk about the night two kings became friends. It wasn't just great entertainment, it was great humanity in action. In a world that often seems divided by generational differences and artistic disagreements, this story reminds us that respect, not rivalry, creates the most beautiful music of all. The contest between Sinatra and Elvis proved that music's greatest moments come not from competition, but from collaboration. Not from proving who's better, but from proving that everyone can be great in their own way when they approach their craft with honesty, respect, and genuine artistry. That's why this story matters. It reminds us that respect, not rivalry, creates the most beautiful music and the most meaningful relationships of all. That November night in 1976, Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley proved that true kings don't need to tear each other down to build themselves up. Their challenge became a celebration. Their rivalry became respect, and their competition became collaboration. They showed us that the strongest response to challenge isn't anger or defensiveness, but excellence delivered with grace and humility. If this story moved you, remember that we all face moments when we can choose competition or collaboration, rivalry or respect. Subscribe to Elvis Presley Legacy. Stories to discover more moments when the king showed us how to handle life's challenges with dignity and grace. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that true strength comes not from defeating others, but from elevating them, because that's what real kings do.